Hello and welcome back to Cognitive Processes. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the brain and how it relates to cognition. So, a little bit of background about the brain will help us understand how we're thinking, how we make decisions, how we understand all those interesting experiments that are part of the field of cognitive psychology. So first of all, a little bit about the brain. Here's a picture of the brain, and imagine that I'm turning my head. The little bulby section at the back is at the back of my head. That looks like a cauliflower at the bottom of the picture. This is a human brain. It's a complex organ with billions of neurons, and it only weighs about 3 pounds. It's really amazing to think about all the things that the brain does, all the complex things that we'll talk about in this course, and it's doing it in this 3 pound little organ. Here's a picture of the brain that is cut entirely in half. Imagine that half my head has been removed, and then you're looking at the brain on the side. Again, whenever you look at a picture of a brain, you orient, at least I like to orient, where the brain is based on the position of the cerebellum, which is that purplish little cauliflower looking structure. Again, always at the center of the brain. So if you are turning your head and you think about that purple structure, then you can think about the brain in that orientation. In this picture, you can see some of the internal structures of the brain, like the corpus callosum that connects the left and the right side of the brain. You can see some of the lower level structures that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then you can see the higher order structures in the cerebral cortex, that is that pinkish color on the outside of the brain, that are so important for so many things that we do as humans. So let's start low. Let's start about the lower part of the brain. The hindbrain and the midbrain, these are the parts of the brain that are very similar across species. And so sometimes people talk about the lizard part of the brain, but basically these are the structures that are the same between humans and, reptiles or things like that. These are the structures, though, that keep us alive, that are super important. So in the hindbrain, the lower part of the brain, you have structures like the medulla that's helping us breathe and maintain our heart rate and our blood pressure. There's the pons that is important for sleep and arousal and balance. And the cerebellum that coordinates all the muscle activity. As you remember, I just said, I always look at a picture of a brain, and then I look for the cerebellum so I can figure out which way the brain is turned in a picture. And so all of those structures are the same in every animal and are so important to maintaining life. Then you have the midbrain, which is a little bit above the hindbrain, but still very lower level structure. And that's the relay center that also is involved in arousal. And so important area of the brain. And then we talk about the forebrain, which is all the front part of the brain. You have the thalamus, which is a relay structure that's relaying to the cerebral cortex in the front. You have the hypothalamus that controls our pituitary gland, and that pituitary gland is so important for so many maintenance behaviors. So when we think about things like homeostatic behaviors, like keeping the correct temperature of our body or maintaining enough food so that we have nutrition and we're drinking enough water so we're hydrated and that we're sleeping properly, that is in the control of the hypothalamus. The hippocampus is an interesting structure because it is so important in memory formation. So we'll come back to the hippocampus again when we talk a lot in the various memory chapters. And then the amygdala. The amygdala is this emotional processing center that is so important in emotional memories and emotional learning. I think that there's just more and more interesting work connecting cognitive processes to emotion. I think, earlier on in the field, people ignored emotion and thought, oh, that's not really like relevant to making decisions. But of course, now we know that when you make a decision, your emotional state when you're making that decision is critical into the type of decision you make or the processing you're using while making those decisions. So I think more and more we think about the trade-offs between, is the amygdala really driving a decision or is the prefrontal cortex driving a decision, things like that. There's some really interesting interplays between some of these structures and other structures that I'm going to mention in a moment. Now, the cerebral cortex, top part of the cortex, this is all color coded to help you sort of see the different areas. And we'll often in this course talk about the prefrontal cortex, which is shown here in green in the frontal cortex area. And that is where we do so many interesting things: impulse control, long term planning, the things that we think about when we think about human unique behaviors. There's also the important areas that are involved in hearing things, auditory cortex, or seeing, processing visual information like the visual cortex. So all these different areas of the cerebral cortex are engaging in different functions that help us to do all those interesting cognitive things. So there are four pairs of lobes in the cerebral cortex, and they all have differing tasks that they do. The frontal cortex is involved in fine motor movements and planning of movements, falling under the motor cortex and the premotor cortex. And then right where your forehead is all the interesting things in the prefrontal cortex that are these executive functions, like controlling your impulses and making long-term plans. So if you think about like how do you plan a career, that's an executive function task that's in your prefrontal cortex. And there's a reason why like kids who don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex have more challenges with those kinds of tasks. Then you have the parietal cortex, that's the sensory information from the body being processed there. Occipital cortex, think about eye level right at the back of your head. You have visual information being processed there. And then auditory cortex at your temples. That's your auditory information, parietal sort of at the top of your head. And so you can think of all these different areas sort of tasked with different roles. And, obviously they're speaking to each other. There's communication in these different areas, but then these different areas have specific functions. So why do we do these sort of analyses of brain function? Why don't we just, think about cognition and think about, the brain as a black box? And part of it has to do with that a lot of the work in cognition is trying to help people who have various conditions. So here's an example. Bruce Willis, he was diagnosed with frontal temporal dementia. And there's a picture of the brain overlay on his picture. And you can see that the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe are impacted in this degenerative dementia. So looking from the side now, which is another way of seeing what kind of happens to a brain for somebody who is suffering from frontal temporal dementia. On the left, you have the healthy brain, the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, and then with this degenerative dementia, you lose brain tissue, you have damage in the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. You can see sort of the shrinkage. The cerebral spinal fluid will fill in around the brain in the skull when there is brain loss. And so why is this interesting to study as part of cognition? Well, as someone has frontal temporal dementia, sometimes they have dementia in the frontal lobes, primary, and later on it moves into damage into the temporal lobes. Or vice versa, it might start with language problems, temporal lobe damage, and then move into the frontal lobes. And so there are different variants that we see in patients based on the damage. And so, for example, when someone has mainly frontal problems first, they will show behaviors and cognition consistent with the functioning of that part of the brain deteriorating. For example, changes in social conduct and behavior, loss of empathy, apathy, disinhibition, lack of insight. Think of, just the things that the frontal lobes do. If the frontal lobes are not working so well because there's brain deterioration in that area, then the symptom pattern will match that. Then you have other patients on the right side, progressive non-fluent aphasia. They may not show any of the patterns of the frontal patients initially, but they have a lot of problems with language and speech. They might have apraxia and effortful speech and have trouble speaking. They may have spared object knowledge and word comprehension, but when you ask them questions, they can't really respond to you very clearly. They understand what you're talking about, but when it comes to speech production, they're having a lot of difficulties. And then you also have patients based on where the damage is. They may lose semantic knowledge. When we talk about semantic knowledge later in the course, that's the knowledge about, what are things? Like, what's a stake? What's a vehicle? Like those kinds of things. That semantic knowledge can be lost specifically. So the patient may look like they have fluent speech, but then they don't have any sort of speech that would indicate that they can't produce speech. But then when you ask them specific questions like what is a vehicle, they actually don't know. They've lost that semantic knowledge. And so, unfortunately, with these degenerative dementias, eventually the patient will acquire all of these problems as the dementia spreads and the loss of the brain tissue spreads. But by studying these dementias, we can have a very clear understanding of what different parts of the brain are used for different things. Controlling our impulses, very different than being able to produce language, very different than also being able to understand what certain categories of objects are, things like that. And, it's just not frontal temporal dementia. You can also look at patient populations that, for example, have another degenerative dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and they'll have a lot of problems with memory. They'll forget to turn their stove off and things like that. And those patterns in Alzheimer's disease can lead to other issues as part of their damage, like they wouldn't be able to draw a clock very well. So if you asked them to draw a clock that said it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they wouldn't be able to put the numbers around the clock, and they would have trouble putting a symmetrical object and that sort of thing. Whereas a patient who has frontal temporal dementia may be perfectly fine doing that task. So what it suggests is that when we have different patterns of dementias or different things that we're looking at throughout the course, it tells us a lot about cognition. For example, memory loss, does that occur early on or late on? Different dementias have different onsets based on what is happening in the brain. And so understanding that, that we have a reason to understand cognition, and part of it is just we purely want to understand how we do things, how we think, how we remember things, how we make decisions, but then also we want to help people. We really truly want to understand things so that when people are suffering from symptoms of various medical conditions, that the more we understand about cognition, the more we can perhaps help them in these medical conditions. Also, it helps us be sort of thoughtful about various things. So, for example, the prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain, it develops really late. You'd be over age 20 before that area of the brain is fully developed. And more and more understanding of the fact that that part of the brain that controls impulses and allows us to, control, our thoughts about long-term planning. That explains why we don't hold underage children to the same standard we hold for adults. We wouldn't let a child sign a cell phone contract because their brain does not really fully understand what they're doing when they're signing a contract for a long-term contract. They can't do that because that prefrontal cortex isn't quite developed at this point. So I think it not only helps us understand various disorders, but it also, studying cognition can help us, and studying cognition in the context of the brain can help us understand human development as well. So when we are talking about these disorders, we're also really trying to make the connection between the cognitive function and the brain. And so part of this brain mapping, you probably remember from other courses, that if there's damage to the Broca's area of the brain, you have non-fluent aphasia and the inability to produce words. Whereas if you have damage to Wernicke's area, you have fluent aphasia, but inability to understand speech and produce meaningful speech. So that they'll be saying words, but it's not meaningful. So they're not actually answering a question that you might ask them. And it seems like, as you have very higher order cognitive processes, thinking and remembering, they may be less localized to one particular area. It's recruiting different areas as part of that. processing, but here and there we do have very specific things that seem to be in specific areas. And it's interesting to know these things. Even just lateralization of function, as you know, the corpus callosum helps connect the right side and the left side of the brain. And part of that communication is some analysis is happening on one side that is primarily on that one side, like language analysis on the left, spatial synthesis on the right. So, understanding how the brain is functioning for these various skills is useful. Now, how do we do this kind of work? Well, there's various brain imaging techniques. CAT scan is maybe used a little less often unless we're looking at damage to a particular location, because it will look at structure and in less detail than maybe some other techniques. If you really want to know about structural damage, you would rely maybe more on magnetic resonance imaging. It's a little bit more expensive to do than the CAT scan, but it does give you a lot more detail about brain structure, and if any brain structure has changed, maybe because of damage or illness or something like that. Also, in other studies, we will look at things like PET and fMRI, so positron emission tomography. We'll look at blood flow in different brain regions, uses radiation and shows which regions are active. But more often you'll see studies where they are doing fMRI, where they're using the magnetic resonance imaging in a functional way that relies on the magnetic properties as blood flows into regions when being used, and that shows activity in brain regions. And that allows us to know like what areas are being used in a particular cognitive task. So here's just a picture of an example of different language functions. When you passively view words versus listen to words to speak words, different areas of the brain are being recruited to be used, and you can see those different brain activity patterns. You can also use EEG to detect different states of consciousness, such as sleep stages. Also, we use MEG sometimes, maybe a little less often. It's the magnetic equivalent to EEG, which allows for a more precise spatial localization of brain region activity. A lot of studies that we'll talk about use ERP, event-related potentials, that measure brain activity before and after a stimulus is presented. You're putting little electrodes around the scalp, so you're not fully localizing function in great detail, but these studies can be very useful in present a stimulus and then see where activity happens immediately after the stimulus presentation. And then TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, also can tell us a lot about specific brain circuits. So in sum, you have the lower parts of the brain, the hindbrain, that's more primitive structures. Then the midbrain is primarily your relay centers. And then the forebrain are all the structures most directly implicated in cognition. And we'll talk about them a lot more in the course. So it's not that the hindbrain and the midbrain aren't important. Obviously, they keep us alive and functioning well, but you will not see as much about those structures in a cognitive processes course, because we are going to focus a lot more on what's going on in the forebrain. So you'll see more information about the different lobes of the cerebral cortex, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and then, a lot of times we'll dig deeper into specific areas or how things are working together. Things like, left hemisphere is doing analytical processing, right hemisphere is doing more synthesis, things like that.